Hello, my name is Peggy Cornett, and welcome to our live stream on the Garden Club of Virginia's restoration of the gardens at Monticello. And I'm curator of plants here at Monticello, and with me on stage today is Peter Hatch, Director Emeritus of the Monticello's Gardens and Grounds, and Candy Crosby, who is a member of the Restoration Committee of the Garden Club of Virginia. And we're delighted to talk about this really long history of the Garden Club's involvement with the garden restoration here. And Peter Hatch would like to begin talking about some of the early people who were involved with making this all happen.
Yeah, the chief instigator for garden restoration at Monticello was the chairman of the Restoration Committee at Monticello named Fisk Kimball, who was a Harvard-educated art and architectural historian who wrote his dissertation at the University of Michigan on Jefferson as an architect. And what he did was he broadcast to the world the fact that Jefferson was an amateur but very talented young architect. Kimball was the chairman of the Restoration Committee at Monticello for some 25 years. He also served as the director of the Philadelphia Museum of Fine Art. But he very early on, as early as 1924, a year after the foundation was established, Kimball was eager to get garden clubs involved in possibly restoring the landscape at Monticello. He worked in tandem with a local architect named Milton Grigg, who was more the nuts and bolts guy who would deal with the technical matters of restoration. And Kimball wrote to garden clubs throughout Virginia and also to the Garden Club of America. He got some local support for an initial project in 1926 to fix the trees, so to speak, to do tree work to save some of the old majestic trees that survived from Jefferson's day. And here's a glorious image of the state-of-the-art of arboriculture in 1925. And on the right is George Van Yeries, who moved to Charlottesville from upstate New York in order to take care of Monticello's trees. And he reestablished his company here. He was the arborist. His son, Mitch, was the arborist at Monticello for some 20 years. Mitch was a strong local figure. He served 20 years in the House of Delegates. He was the mayor of Charlottesville. And these images of this early work to salvage and to restore the early trees at Monticello is a wonderful expression of early American arboriculture.
And I believe that they believe there were 13 original trees at that time, back in the 1920s. So
yes,
yeah.
Two of the major figures from the Garden Club of Virginia and actually the Albemarle Garden Club who were really instrumental in restoring Monticello's gardens. One was Susan Massey. She was the power broker of the Garden Club of Virginia. She was in the local Albemarle Garden Club. The Massey Medal for distinctive service is the Garden Club's most prestigious and oldest medal. She wrote a book on old homes and gardens in Virginia. She had a beautiful estate called Rose Hill in western Albemarle County that was designed by Charles Gillette. She was the power broker. The woman who got things done, however, was Hazel Perkins, who lived in what she called the shadow of Monticello. Her dedication to historical authenticity was remarkable. She wrote that if Jefferson had planted thus and so, we should do the same thing, carry out his ideas with trying to please the man whose spirit is still felt in Charlottesville and Albemarle County.
And her granddaughter is still in the Albemarle Garden Club today.
That's where I got the picture.
Yeah. Yeah.
But Perkins, Hazel kept a diary. She's had speeches, and she wrote a book on the flower garden restoration. And we learned from her a lot about the methodology of the decision-making process by which the gardens were restored.
And I think one thing too, Peter, that's so important is that they really insisted on high standards and the work they wanted done.
Yeah, we'll talk about some of the schisms in the committee about who wanted to do what later on.
Okay.
Kimball kept going with trying to find support for restoring gardens. He struck out with the Garden Club of Virginia initially, and then went to the Garden Club of America and wrote to the president of the Garden Club of America, a woman named Mrs. Irving Pratt. And she decided to invest some money in the restoration on the condition that Monticello hire a landscape architect named Amy Cogswell. an expert on colonial gardens and old-fashioned flowers. And this is in 1927. In the letters between Cogswell and Kimball, Cogswell is irritatingly chirpy and kind of impulsive, but also very self-effacing and thrifty. Kimball asked Perkins and Massey to help out when Cogswell came to Charlottesville. He wrote, "You will find her a delightful companion." Cogswell arrived on a train, and she was immediately shuffled off to meet the members of the Albemarle Garden Club. And after a visit, she came to Monticello and laid out beds on the west front of the house, made a plan, ordered plants, expressed a lot of frustration with the sources she was using, including the Anne Braddock Peticolas painting of Monticello from 1825. Another source she used was a rectilinear plan that Jefferson made of beds on the west front of Monticello. Anyway, there was a great firestorm of protest from the ladies of the Albemarle Garden Club. Mrs. Massey wrote to Kimball and said, "I would be happy, delighted if this was done properly." And she underlined the word properly. Kimball said he was delighted with Cogswell, but wrote to the president of the foundation, Stuart Gibney, who was in New York, that her work was unfortunate. Nevertheless, 10 years later, and Cogswell dismissed herself from the project because of this firestorm of protest. She wrote to Kimball and said, "Would not a Southern woman be more acceptable than a Yankee? Or better yet, a man, capital M, capital A, capital N." So it was an unfortunate beginning for restoration at Monticello that plagued the early days of the foundation, which was in really bad shape in terms of indebtedness and also in the condition of the property itself. In 1933, an official for the Civilian Conservation Corps came to Monticello, and he wrote after visiting that the income derived from visitors is totally inadequate to maintain or replace or pay for the debt. I'm concerned that this beautiful shrine will fall into decay. So Monticello was in trouble, but Fisk Kimball persevered in trying to get support from the Garden Club, and he wrote Susan Massey in 1938 and asked for $10,000. And she wrote back that there is only one Monticello, and if the consensus of opinion is that this should be done, I am very much in sympathy. From Perkins's diary, we know a lot about the numerous alternatives that the committee that was formed had before them in order to restore the gardens at Monticello. One possibility that Perkins talked about was recreating Jefferson's grotto around the North Spring. He talked about paving the floors with pebbles from Harper's Ferry in West Virginia, speckling the walls with translucent shells and moss from Hanover Town along the James River. There'd be a nymph of the grot statue and a poem by Horace that was translated into English. Fortunately, she wrote that this would be a beautiful and authentic project, but she then later crossed out the word authentic because obviously this was way beyond Jefferson's capabilities.
It would have been cool if they had it though, huh?
I think they should do it now.
She also considered that rectilinear plan that Jefferson did early at showing flower beds in the west front of the house that Amy Cogswell considered when she was laying out beds. They also talked about putting in the vegetable garden at Monticello rather than the flower gardens. And after the restoration was completed, Hazel Perkins wrote that we were frankly asked, why did we want to mess up the west lawn with a bunch of flowers? We could have had a vegetable garden and sold produce to the visitors who came to Monticello.
Yeah.
I would have made money.
Anyway.
Edwin Bets suddenly appeared as the committee was debating what form the restoration might come. He was a major force. He was a scholar, a professor of botany at the University of Virginia. He was a documentary scholar of the first rank. He edited Thomas Jefferson's garden book, the family letters of Thomas Jefferson's farm book. Mrs. Perkins described him as a shy, sensitive student type of man, whatever that might mean. But anyway, what Bets initially did was he found a missing manuscript that was drawn by Jefferson in 1807 in mid-April, showing 20 oval flower beds in what Jefferson called the corners or the angles of the house. Each bed was planted with a different type of ornamental flower. And Jefferson was doing this really difficult period of his presidency. He was having these migraine headaches, and the Aaron Burr trial was taking place in Richmond, Virginia. So this difficult period of his presidency, what was he doing but designing flower beds for his retirement to Monticello?
Makes sense.
Why not?
Gardening for Jefferson was a real retreat, I think, from the slings and arrows of political life. So this was a great discovery. A few months later, Jefferson got a letter saying that the seeds that he'd planted in these oval flower beds had not germinated. So despite this setback, he sketched on the back of a letter to his daughter Anne this winding walk that went around the west lawn. And along the walk was to be a narrow flower border that extended along its entire length. And both the oval beds and the winding walk were actually executed by Thomas Jefferson. The irreverent garden writer Henry Mitchell has written that when Jefferson found he couldn't take care of a small garden, he just decided to make it 3 times larger, like any good gardener, of course.
Of course.
But he also wrote that he thought the winding walk would allow them to have all the room they needed for all the plants they wanted to grow, that they didn't have enough room in the oval beds to grow everything he wanted to grow. So it just expanded their acreage, I guess, of plants.
Perkins also said that the garden club members would drive up at night along the edge of the west lawn and shine their headlights across the west lawn where they could pick up the depression of the winding walk, and also raised narrow flower beds where flowers were still coming up 125 years after Jefferson
that
died.
image, Peter, of a car full of Albemarle Garden Club ladies driving up on the front lawn here with their car and lighting up the landscape. Isn't that how they saw the outline of the beds too?
Yeah,
Right.
I think Morley
Yeah.
Williams sort of preceded them in doing that, and they got the idea from
Yeah.
them.
Yeah, Perkins confessed that it was a landscape architect named Morley Williams who 6 years earlier had come to Monticello and done the same thing.
Yeah.
And Williams was a major figure in historic landscape restorations at the time. He restored and designed the restoration of the gardens at Mount Vernon, at Stratford Hall, and also Tryon Palace in North Carolina. And Williams was known for his dedication to landscape archaeology, and he was a true pioneer. But like tree work in the early 20th century, landscape archaeology was pretty crude by our standards today.
Yeah. What is he holding in this picture? Do we know? It looks like, is it some kind of,
That's
is
the
it
only.
a surveying
I'm not
tool
sure what he's
or
doing
what?
in that picture.
Yeah,
It's very
I looked at it, I
unusual,
couldn't figure it out.
You were in the North Pavilion today doing this live stream, and in the 1939 restoration, the restoration committee would meet in here, and they would really doll it up with love seats and antiques and an antique clock and books, and also fresh flowers that came from a local greenhouse. And the committee would meet, and then they retired to Farmington Country Club for lunch.
Maybe they had a martini
The
too.
ladies, yes. Or 2. So.
Now here's the ultimate plan that was worked on by Garland Wood, a Richmond landscape architect. And it's a beautiful scale drawing that reputedly was done by a man who I knew pretty well at Monticello, who was an architect who aided us in a number of restoration projects, Floyd Johnson.
Oh, I didn't know
And
that.
it's a beautiful drawing.
Yeah, it really is.
It includes on the east front of the house the post and chain planting. This is from a plan that Jefferson, I'm not really sure we have a good date on this, The Garden Club of America actually introduced this project in 1944, I think it was. It involves a post and chain going along the east front, defining the actual level terrace at the top of the mountain. And along the post and chain were intermittent plantings of weeping willow and flowering shrubs.
I was looking at Dorothy Hunt Williams' book last night, and I noticed in 1944, they also did some work on the graveyard, the entrance to the graveyard. They restored the brickwork there, the entrance and the drive into it. I didn't know that. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, that was awesome.
Yeah.
Hazel Perkins resigned from the committee that was taking care of the gardens. It had a rough start. They had one gardener who was burned up in a fire. They had another gardener that resigned very quickly. And the project, the restoration, cost some $17,000. And the conditions were that Monticello would take care of the gardens and also develop a suitable water supply for their irrigation in the summertime. In return, the garden club initially got 25% of the gate receipts from the first week of garden week. Interesting.
Yeah, Garden Week, yeah.
Interesting deal.
That's right, yeah.
When Perkins retired in 1950, she made 4 requests of Fisk Kimball. The first was to get rid of the bathrooms that were underneath the south terrace, which really wasn't done until probably 8, 9 years, 10 years ago.
Yep.
They moved them over to below the north terrace. They had to go somewhere. And then secondly, she asked Kimball to get a resident manager for Monticello. And it's incredible to think that Monticello was run from New York City.
Yeah.
And even Fisk Kimball lived in Philadelphia, and he'd commute down here for meetings. And so they actually hired a man named Curtis Thacker to be the superintendent of gardens and grounds. And part of the reason he was hired was that he was supposedly the best gardener in Albemarle County. She also asked Kimball to get rid of the African-American interpreters who were dressed in costume and livery, who would often greet visitors to Monticello and give interpretive tours of the house itself. Really a regress to the Old South, if there ever was one. Finally, she asked Kimball to institute a flower arranging program for the house at Monticello, which was a program that really survived some 50 years until my early years at Monticello.
That's right, yeah.
So she was a very progressive person and also diehard, and she wouldn't give up. She also wrote that if we can't execute the plans of Thomas Jefferson, I don't want to do them. So hats off to her and all the other members of the initial committee. There was probably some discontent with the flower gardens. In 1954, the foundation hired a very renowned landscape architect named Alden Hopkins to do something about the nature of the flower garden restoration, or perhaps its maintenance. Hopkins was well known. He was the landscape architect for Colonial Williamsburg, a very prestigious role at the time. And he also designed a lot of the most beautiful gardens at the University of Virginia. But Hopkins seemed pretty disappointed with the character of the gardens. He described them as disjointed rather than dignified and composed. He said they were too ragged, they lacked uniformity. So he installed a lot of oval beds with mounded evergreens, Pfister juniper, Japanese dwarf yews, lollipop standards of Japanese euonymus, really an infusion of Asian plants that Jefferson would never known. He wrote that the oval beds around the house for Jefferson were just a trial, and he would have soon realized their poor value. So interesting perception. I've been reading his letters recently and his notes on the flower gardens, and I've changed my opinion. I think he actually had some really good ideas that were not endorsed by the foundation. And the things like the lollipop Japanese euonymus you see on the screen here may have been put in by Curtis Thacker rather than under the leadership of Alden Hopkins.
I think nowadays they call that meatballing.
These were all sort of 1950s popular concepts, foundation plantings, using evergreens to to put mustaches on the house. It's a very kind of old-fashioned.
But that was not supported by the Garden Club of Virginia, that planting.
No,
Up
that was
Yeah.
when
Yeah.
I first came here,
Right.
1979, and you can see it was a good year. It was my first year really having a great tulip display at Monticello.
Yeah, they're
I
spectacular.
was proud of my plantings, and eventually soon got rid of the lollipop euonymus and the Pfister junipers planted as foundation plantings. And I arrived in 1977, and this was my staff of groundsmen, as they were referred to. They were forest fighters. They drove buses. They filled the drink machines. I could talk all day about the characters in this photograph that appeared in the Daily Progress in the summer, 6 months before I arrived at Monticello. And horticulture at Monticello at the time really meant flower arranging, and that was a big deal. What's now the vegetable garden was an oasis of annual flowers that were used for arrangements in the house. They were done by a woman named Dawn Woltz, who was very talented. And every 2 or 3 days, she'd make some 8, 9, 10 arrangements every 2 or 3 days. And I had a few gardeners in that image. Most of them were groundskeepers who mowed grass and drove the buses and cut up trees. Filbert Roach in the far left was a indefatigable weed puller. Phil Page is the fifth from the left, was the son of the man who owned Page Florist in Charlottesville. He'd been to Virginia Tech. He was a talented gardener.
Right.
He propagated plants in the greenhouse.
I remember that greenhouse. That was a beautiful floral shop. Yeah.
Isn't Charlie Bishop and Charles Moore in that picture?
Yeah, they're all there.
I knew them.
Phil went on to become the superintendent of grounds at Dunbar and Oaks. He had a storied career. He was a fine and talented gardener. But our staff evolved over the years a great deal. But a lot of those guys were amazing men. Many of them came from the mountains. They had uncanny skills with the chainsaw and the backhoe, and have really vivid and fond memories of them over the years.
So these are just some transition slides showing images of the winding walk here in the summer with the wonderful globe amaranth and the high summer flowers that will be coming into bloom in just a month or so from now. I think the next image might be going backwards to springtime, but we want to talk a little bit or add another. Yeah, here we go. Poppies are in bloom right now. This is the season for poppies and Sweet William and the hardy annuals and the biennials that are really just a lovely time of year in my mind, in a transition before the summer flowers come into play. And Jefferson once wrote that the flowers come forth like the bells of the day, have their short reign of beauty and splendor, and then retire to the more interesting office of reproducing their like. So these will be reproducing their like soon. But we want to move on to a more recent project that the Garden Club of Virginia has undertaken with the Kitchen Road Restoration Project. And Candy would like to talk a little bit more about that if we move along to the
This is the second
images.
big project of the Garden Club of Virginia at Monticello. I was on the Restoration Committee in 2013 when conversations started talking about it. And Peggy and Peter, I believe you were both at the meeting that we had with down at when the offices were down there by the Weaver's Cottage.
I believe the date on this was in 2007, so it was in the works for a long time.
Right. There was a lot of conversation. There was a lot of discussion with the Garden Club of Virginia about possibly doing this project. And William Beiswanger was Director of Restoration, and Fraser Neiman was doing the archaeological work. So we had these two, there's Bill Beiswanger. He still is a wonderful man, I'm sure. And we were able to, our landscape architect, William Riley, used the knowledge they had put together on, Bill Beiswanger was
Restoration and
Director of
retired
Restoration, retired now, but his subject was mapping these roads that Jefferson had onto, and you probably still see remnants of the roads. Do you on the mountains around here?
Oh, the roundabout.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. But Bill's specialty was mapping these roads, and he convinced us that the Kitchen Road project was something we should really consider and do, which we did. I remember having lunch with Sally Guy Brown, who was chairman of the Restoration Committee at that time, and she gave it the green light. The committee approved it, and there you see how on the left side of the screen here, is that correct? That's how it looked before, with these walls and trees, and
Parking lot.
a parking lot from the 30s or something, and you hate to take down a tree. I know that was hard, but on the right you see how the mulberries were really established, and the road would go up to the house and from the stable.
Well, this is kind of a way of getting you on board,
Yeah.
but then what he ended up doing is, if you go to the next one, is showing a before with people in it. So there you are, actually,
Yeah.
next to Bill.
There I am next to Bill,
on
and
the
he's
road,
explaining to me. He was
trying
so
to convince
patient,
her,
so
envision this.
patient explaining it to me. I was like, oh yeah, well,
And then go to the next slide.
it was
and
great,
you'll see,
yeah. There we are with the mulberries planted.
the beauty of Photoshop.
That Photoshop, which Will Wiley did, our wonderful landscape architect for the Garden Club of Virginia. Well, what can you say? I looked at that. I thought, oh man, I'm on this.
You're on
you know.
board, yeah.
And it was just it was a fun project, and you can see the beauty of those mulberries too, and that the road was reestablished.
These are the old brick steps that
right.
were there from the early 20th
Right,
century.
right, and you could really see there was what was that thing that stuck out surrounded by rocks that
Well,
was
there's a
in there too?
millstone, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, you mean the,
What was that?
Privy?
Yeah, was it the
privy.
privy? Yeah,
That's
the privy,
still
of course, and that's still there, but it was,
Privy Tunnel.
but it was so prominent, it's somehow, but it was
it was
this
made like a
way.
shrine. and stuff.
Yeah, yeah. So those are the
Go on
old
to the next
steps, and
one.
then if you go to the next slide, I think you can see
This-
this is the archaeology that Fraser Neiman was conducting to
Yeah,
show us the kitchen, where the kitchen path was, which went from the vegetable garden up to the kitchen, right, Peter?
On the axis of the
It was on
house.
the
Yeah,
axis of the
right.
If you
house.
look closer, you can see the precision of that work, what
Right.
the original walkway really looked like.
Uh-huh.
Those large stones laid in a really kind of a dense and formidable format.
You can see where the other steps were really leading you from
Yeah.
the east front of the house, and they
Yeah.
weren't at all on axis with what the original intention of the plan was to be. So this is all still underground, and if you go to the next slide, you'll
On
see.
the next slide, you'll
how,
see this beautiful floating staircase that Will Wiley designed. There are no footers underneath it, and it preserves the archaeological record that's underneath. And it's a very elegant design too. It's very short risers, and the railings on it are very, very good. And it's just a really good example of the kind of quality work that the Garden Club of Virginia has supported
Yeah.
at Monticello over the years. And this was outstanding. Beautiful.
And the last slide just shows kind of an aerial view of the final road configuration as it is now. Of course, a few years have gone by since it. This was all came about in about 2015, so it's a few years old now. But
It's
the
aging
trees have
well.
been planted
It's
and they're
aging well,
aging,
yeah.
maturing, and so this really kind of linked the kitchen to the vegetable garden and to Mulberry Row in a very accurate way, in the original way in which it was intended to be. So, so I think our last slide is just kind of a pretty picture of Monticello. And
Yeah, I'd like to interject about the another project of the Garden Club of Virginia, which
Yeah.
I think is particularly significant. And it's somewhat timely with our discussion today because Fisk Kimball, with his wife Marie, who was the curator at Monticello and also wrote a book on cooking at Monticello, built their house just outside of Charlottesville in the 1950s on a mountain called Shack Mountain. And it was a beautifully designed Jeffersonian house. It's an octagon, very much like Poplar Forest. And the Garden Club of Virginia for the last 25 years has sponsored a fellowship program where landscape architectural graduate students come to Virginia and they study a historic garden, a historic landscape, either public or private. And over those 25 years, they've produced some amazing records documenting these gardens, but also doing a lot of research on them. And there's some of the greatest hits of Virginia landscapes, places like Mount Airy and Westover and Bremo, which is along the James River, owned by General Koch and a close friend of Jefferson. But one of the fellowships is named after Will Riley, who was the landscape architect for the Garden Club for some 20 years, and another fellowship is named after Rudy Favretti, who was the landscape architect who preceded him. And so it's another project of the Garden Club that's really furthering the field of historic landscapes and historic landscape preservation in Virginia.
Yeah, that's good, Peter. Thank you for bringing that up. And if you go to the Garden Club of Virginia website, you can access those reports. Shack Mountain was done in 2012, for example, and the full PDF is online and available to read. And they're fascinating. They're real documents. They're solid research.
And they assist in many restoration projects or to make the argument to get funding for certain things as well. So
they were supervised by Riley and Associates for several years there.
And they're real, publication quality at university.
Yeah, that's right.
They're pretty,
they're
beautiful. Well done.
Yeah, we're very proud of that work.
I think we've just covered just about everything in this topic, but we hope people have enjoyed this program. I've found it a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Talk to these distinguished people in this room, in this place where the Garden Club first met, to discuss the restoration. It's a fascinating story, and it's still ongoing. I mean, we have a wonderful relationship with the Garden Club of Virginia. In fact, many of the restoration committees visiting today, and they're probably wandering around the gardens, even in the rain. And
so happy to be here.
We're really pleased.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.